Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
When it happened, it seemed like an inconvenience. A water main break that was essentially a plumbing issue. Then the news began to get worse, and that hasn't really stopped since. More than a week later, this is now what's happening in Calgary.
At 8 a.m. this morning, I signed the paperwork to declare a local state of emergency for the city of Calgary. Now, I hate to do this to you, Calgary, but I'm going to have to do it again. We are going to need to reduce our water use, and I'm relying on you so that we can get through this.
The city is now looking at least 3 to 5 weeks of water restrictions while repairs are underway, according to the mayor. That's a timeline that happens to overlap directly with the city's signature tourist event. That is, to put it plainly, a huge disaster. So what actually happened? How did one water main break turn into a state of emergency? And why did that break happen in the first place? Could the city's taps really run dry? I'm Jordan Heath-Rawlings. This is The Big Story. Kerry Black is an assistant professor and Canada Research Chair in the Department of Civil Engineering at the University of Calgary. Hello, Kerry.
Hi.
How in demand are civil engineering professors in the media right now in Calgary?
Well, particularly ones that aren't doing their laundry very often or washing their hair, I think, is the ones that are being reached out to the most.
Can you start, just for our listeners outside of Calgary, explaining the crisis that's happening right now, and then we'll get into the specifics of it.
Yeah, sure. So essentially, about just over 10 days now ago, our main water main that feeds a good portion of the city had a pretty catastrophic collapse. And so what that meant was that we couldn't get enough water across the city. And so everybody had to reduce their water use. And in particular, residents that lived in and around where this pipe sort of burst had to go on a boil water advisory for a few days. And so it's been quite a major event. Normally, we see these things happen on a small scale with little water mains that feed our roads and homes. However, this is on the main feeder line. So it's pretty, catastrophic failure and a pretty massive impact to the residents of Calgary.
Can you explain a little bit more about the engineering of the water grid? Like, why is that one pipe or that one section of the pipe responsible for so much of the city's water? Is this common?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's very common, and depending on the size of your city, to have a couple key main sections of pipe that are delivering water from your water treatment plant across the city. And so the bigger the city, the more pipe you have underground delivering across the city. And so Calgary is quite a spread out city, but just like any North American city, you're going to have a need to get as much water across the city from the water treatment plant. There's typically one or two, depending on the size. And they've got to transport a lot of that water across. And then from that main sort of line, you're going to have smaller pipes that come off that feed a certain neighborhood, a certain section of the city. And so it's really common to have, a couple larger pipes. Those are going to go down to smaller pipes and then smaller pipes as we get closer and closer to home. So that by the time it gets to your home, you don't have a 2-meter wide pipe that's feeding your home. You have a much smaller size.
Do we know what exactly happened to that key water main and how it broke? And is that usual?
It's pretty common for water mains to, spring a leak, to have some failures. They're usually on smaller water mains, though. It's a little bit different when it's a large pipe. So this pipe is this, massive 2-meter wide, you can drive your truck through it kind of pipe. These are pretty strong pipes. So they've got to be able to carry a lot of water. They're under pressure, but they also, are buried underground. And so there's implications to what's happening above the ground. We don't exactly know what the cause was in this case. And that's not necessarily uncommon either. There's a lot of factors. Was there maybe some sort of failure that happened during the manufacturing process? When I was installing the pipe, did something happen that maybe we didn't catch at the time? Or could be surrounding activities, upstream or downstream of that pipe. Then there's the factor of corrosion. As they pulled the pipe out, they saw these kinds of pipes usually are reinforced with steel cables that go wrapped around the entire pipe. They saw that those were exposed. They're not meant to be exposed. And so that's an indication that there's something really quite wrong there. But really at this point, it's hard to point the finger, and it may remain difficult to point the finger as to exactly what happened. However, we usually do a lot of due diligence to make sure that we're staying on top of, where these things might happen. We do a little inspections, we do an assessment condition. As you can imagine, any city has thousands of kilometers of pipe underground. And so pretty challenging to do all of that all the time. And so you've got to set up a plan where you're looking at certain pipes first. And certainly this size of pipe, those are the ones that you're usually spending your most amount of resources on, because when they do fail, it has pretty big impacts like what we're seeing.
One of the things that I found interesting, and I say interesting as somebody not impacted by this, sitting in Toronto, it must be incredibly frustrating to see this if you're a Calgarian, is, you first heard about a water main breaking, then it became a critical water main breaking, and then and maybe you can explain, as I understand it, as they've dug into the problem, they've found other potential problems that are going to extend the amount of time for repair?
Yeah. So, when something first happens, you don't entirely sure how bad it is. So in this case, we had that failure that occurred the evening before. Ultimately, this, became national news. And once they sort of turned that pipe offline and they excavated the pipe, because it's not until you see it that you see how bad things are.
Right.
That's when you realize, okay, we've got quite a significant problem. But as soon as you turn a water main, offline, gives you a chance to really take some time and make sure that there's nothing else going on. In this case, they spent a lot of time to figure out, while they're repairing, while it's offline anyways, let's get some cameras in there. Let's see what the state is. Unfortunately and fortunately, let's be honest, they found additional hot spots. And those are places where they think there's, the structural integrity of the pipe has been compromised. And if that's the case, you're never going to, just put the dirt back in and let it and hope, things work out okay. You're going to take the time to repair them. And so, while many might be inconvenienced at the thought of additional delays, we should probably be pretty happy about it, because it means that we're going to minimize the impact later on. It means that we're going to minimize the potential for some sort of disaster later on of this magnitude.
We've heard some fairly dire things, I guess, from the city's mayor, including at one point, I believe it was said that at some point the taps will run dry if things don't change. Can you give us a sense of how critically this has impacted the city's available water supply?
With that main water main being down, you now have got, essentially think of it as, your main highway of getting in and out of the city is out of commission. You've only got smaller ways that you can get water to where you need it the most. In this case, or in the case of the highway example, roads that you can get there, but it can't transport as many cars as quickly, right? And so that's the situation we're in. We can't get as much water across the city as we were when this water main was intact. And so what that means is people have got to use less. Now, you're hoping that people use less, but if they don't, they're going to start to eat into what's typically saved for emergency management and critical response. When that happens, it triggers a very different set of events, because you actually can't eat into those supplies. You need to ensure, from a public health perspective, that everybody who needs water is getting it. And your lawn doesn't need water.
Right.
Your dishes don't necessarily need to be cleaned. Certain businesses don't necessarily need to operate at 100%. If it means you're taking water away from, hospitals and areas that, critically require it for people to stay alive, people that might need it for other reasons. And then emergency response. Fires is a really great example. You can't be in a situation where a fire truck can't access the water. So the notion that taps are going to run dry was more, to me, of a warning that if we don't reduce our water, we're going to have to put more stringent measures in place. And that's, I think, the message that was sent out. Now, what usually happens is that your reservoir can hold so much water. Once you've taken too much out of that reservoir and you don't have enough left, that's what triggers the next phase. And that's what we saw on the weekend, was some pretty significant concern on Friday before the weekend started that, hey, if you don't reduce your water, we're in a situation that we can't be in.
Right.
And so if we don't band together, we're going to have to take more extreme measures. And I think that's what the city was really trying to avoid.
Do we know how well conservation efforts have been going? I know as these measures were announced, there were a whole bunch of people complaining online, and there were some conspiracy theories going around. However, I also know that is not real life. Do we have a sense of normal compliance in the city? Yeah,
you know what? We did pretty well. On Friday, we really struggled. Our numbers were going up, and that's usually not necessarily uncommon. So when something first happens, you're going to take action. And then as time goes, it feels like less of an urgency. And so it's, you're going to see an uptick. The mayor had to go back out and say, hey, we're not doing a very good job. And this means that we're going to have a significant problem. Calgarians were able to reduce it further. So we had gotten to a 21% reduction. It ticked up to about 18% reduction. But over the weekend, we hit our lowest levels. And part of that, I think, was in direct response to what the mayor had been saying about, the state of affairs. So the good thing is that we were able to reduce to that 25% mark, whereas up until, Friday, Saturday, we weren't able to do that. But if you look at where we're at right now, we're at about, 450 million of liters of water per day, which was the target.
Okay.
And that was the 25% reduction. And so, yeah, we did well. We had a couple moments there where it got a little dire, but I think we did band together and reduce ultimately. And that means that you've got that buffer for critical emergency and response.
Fatigue can play a role here in terms of, constant conservation is pretty tough. And people do, lawns aside, people do want to wash their clothes and stuff. Can you give us a sense? Like, I'm seeing headlines, it'll still be weeks here.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be at least another week and a half. If I had to, estimate, and knowing that it's that 3 to 5 week estimate is what they put out there, because they have to be realistic. It takes a while to do it right. The last thing you want are people to rush this, right? And so, yeah, it's going to be a little while longer. But really, part of the reality that Calgarians and Canadians and North Americans need to realize is that the amount of water that we use as individuals is so much higher than what we see in an international context. We actually don't need that much water, but you wouldn't know it based on our usage. And so we spend a lot of time watering our lawns and outdoor water use, and that's got to change. Our relationship with water needs to change. And many water experts have been saying this for decades. And so it's a long overdue conversation that I think we're having. It's normal to sort of lose that level of urgency, but we've got to keep it up. And it's not that difficult. Yeah, you have to do laundry. Yeah, you have to wash your dishes, but there's things that you can do to conserve your water more. And I think it's a minor short-term inconvenience in the grand scheme of things. And I work mostly with Indigenous communities and First Nations communities in Canada. And a few weeks would be a blessing or a gift to a lot of communities that are inconvenienced.
Right.
They've been on these sorts of advisories for years, decades even. And so we need to be a bit more realistic, I think. And it's unfortunate that some people don't see that urgency, but as things continue and as drought in particular becomes more of an issue, especially for the prairie regions, water conservation is going to be huge. And why not try it out now while you have a chance to really sort of become an expert at it?
Well, the really interesting thing, the strange coincidence, is on the 5th, while this was breaking, we were interviewing Tyler Dawson, a reporter from the National Post, who just did this huge feature on Alberta's drought. And he mentioned kind of the water main breakage. And at that point, it was not seen as a huge problem. But he was like, this is something that might become a part of daily life in Alberta, in the years to come.
Absolutely. And you know what? In other jurisdictions in Canada, water restrictions aren't necessarily that shocking. I mean, I moved from the interior of BC and summer water restrictions were normal. The reality is you don't need, a bright green grass in your front lawn if you're living in a place that's, basically a desert. There's a reality to what we live in a Canadian context. And gone are the days of just being able to use whatever we want, whenever we want to use it. Unfortunately, though, I think the way that I've seen it, especially over the last 20 years, is that no one does anything until it impacts them directly. We saw that in the 2013 floods. You don't necessarily take it seriously till it's your basement or house flooded. And then maybe, you start to take actions, or, you take an action in the moment and you return back. I think one of the worst things that could come out of this situation is if everyone was to return to normal. And so after this, you return to using water in the same ways that you always have. That would be really unfortunate. I think the easiest place to start is outdoor water use. The number of rainwater barrels that were purchased earlier this year in Alberta in particular, as soon as we started talking about drought, was huge. But that probably should have happened already. Why aren't we taking, the water that falls on our homes and conserving it? We don't get that much, here in Southern Alberta, but when we do, why not take as much of that as we can to water our plants? Do we need to wash our car 475 times? Probably not.
Yep.
It's not a really great use of water. If you're using recycled water, sure. But, that's not necessarily the case. So there's some realities that I think people need to be hit with. And when we look internationally, it's a bit of an embarrassment in terms of how much we waste our water. When we look at countries that aren't as water resourced as we are, they look to us as almost, crazy for the way in which we use our water. It would be absolutely unacceptable to do the kinds of things that we do with water anywhere else in North America. The optimist in me says, I think we can get there if we continue to keep this momentum. But the pessimist in me almost says that we would need regular water main breaks of this magnitude or regular droughts for people to take it seriously. There are ways to help people reduce their water. Certainly, when gas prices go up, we tend to fill up less. We tend to, conserve it better.
Right.
The same could be said in water.
As this drags on, from a civil engineering or just, I guess, civil maintenance point of view, what measures are there to get water where it needs to go that we haven't tried yet and could potentially use to get water, especially to those neighborhoods that are most affected?
Yeah, so right now we're seeing that, across Calgary, everyone's getting the water that they need.
Okay.
What would happen in cases where we didn't get the water we needed? Let's say we didn't conserve and we had to put stronger measures in place. You would get into a situation where there would be individuals who might have to resort to bottled water. There may be a condition where we have to start looking at overland transportation of water, which the city is already looking into. That's basically like a giant flexible pipe that goes over the land and delivers water where we need it. That doesn't address water conservation, though. And I think if you look at the numbers, what we see is that we can easily stay below the 25% mark without any of these measures. Mm-hmm. Now, they're going to look at those just in case things get worse. But the reality is, we can do this. You can reduce your water use by 50% if you really wanted to. It's not that hard. So these other measures that we could take certainly will help, but it won't address the part where we still need to conserve. And that's, short-term pain for long-term gain in this case.
Does this crisis tell you anything about Calgary's infrastructure or the state of its water grid that you didn't already know? I mean, I've seen some criticism of how a main this big was allowed to break, but I don't know enough to decide if that's something that, we should be taking a serious look at or not.
What I think would shock a lot of people is the city of Calgary actually has quite a thorough plan for maintaining its water mains. They have regular inspections and assessment of their pipes and actually have one of the lower levels of leaks or water main breaks in the country. And so Calgary being, essentially a leader in this space and still having this sort of issue should be huge alarm bells for other cities. The reality is other cities of this size don't necessarily invest as much time and resources. And it's not because they don't want to. There's this notion that we just let this happen. No, in fact, every public works department across North America has to do so much with so little. Mm-hmm. And that's because as a city, you only got, a certain amount of resources you can put towards things. And every citizen has lots of different requests for how they want that money to be spent. They don't necessarily want their money going towards things they can't see. But the city, lots of cities do the best they can to try and stay on top of this. They do ongoing condition assessments and maintenance programs to help identify these problems before they happen. But obviously, it's impossible to look at every single stretch of pipe every single year. Mm-hmm. And so you're looking at prioritizing certain places over others. You're looking at what else you can do to maximize that. Other cities should be looking at this and going, this is a big one. If we better take another look at, what is our maintenance plans for our current infrastructure? And then I think the provincial and federal governments need to take a much closer look. So they've recognized this massive infrastructure deficit, but they also, haven't necessarily invested enough money. They've started to, but over the last 30, 40 years, they've decreased their investments in infrastructure and put more of the burden on cities and municipalities. The small cities and rural municipalities across Canada should really be, sounding alarm bells here because they've got even smaller revenues to be able to tackle their infrastructure. And that's a huge issue.
Last question, and it's with an eye to the future. We've mentioned that the 3 to 5 week timeline is kind of what the city has to give. I should point out the Calgary Stampede is due to start July 5th. That is 18 days or less than 3 weeks from now. Do we know whether or not the Stampede will proceed as normal, and should it?
Well, if you know Calgarians, you know it takes a whole lot to cancel the Stampede.
Yeah.
And so at this point, I don't think anything's going to get in the way of that. But, it could mean that we think of creative ways of reducing our water footprint. We think of, bringing in different resources, specifically water, to help address, in particular, animal welfare, I would say.
They could drink less water and more beer.
You know what? I've been saying to many of my friends, if ever there was a time to reconsider what you're drinking.
Right.
But certainly they have other implications for the animals they bring in, washing them, all sorts of things. It's actually quite a water-intensive process.
Yeah.
I don't think you're going to see the Stampede being canceled. I'm not a betting kind of gal, but I'd be willing to put money on it. I think where they're at right now is they're doing as much as they possibly can to ensure that by the time the Stampede hits, they're not in that situation.
Kerry, thank you so much for this. I understand this problem a lot better than I did before this conversation. It's much appreciated.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks for having me.
Kerry Black, Department of Civil Engineering at the University of Calgary. That was the big story. For more, including our episode on Alberta's drought that featured the very first news of this water main breakage, you can head to thebigstorypodcast.ca. You can offer us some feedback by shooting an email to hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or by calling us and leaving a voicemail. The number is 416-935-5935. The Big Story is available in your favorite podcast player and my favorite podcast player, whichever one that happens to be. You can ask for it on a smart speaker by saying, "Play the Big Story podcast." Thanks for listening. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. We'll talk tomorrow.